Good afternoon and welcome to this special edition of Halftime Talk, a review program typically held in the middle of every week where we review the sort of big trends impacting the energy markets, in particular the oil markets. And of course, recently we had the big development and the change in the Brent structure. And as a curtain raiser to that, we had a wonderful new book by a colleague and friend of everybody, Adi Imsirovic, who wrote a book titled Brent Crude Oil: Genesis and Development of the World's Most Important Oil Benchmark. And Adi did a nice structure to his book. He went back and sought out all of those who were there at the beginning 40 years ago when Brent was in its infancy, and got their insights as to the birth and purpose of this amazing benchmark that still serves and leads 40 years later, and a very critical time for the energy markets. The recent decision by the curator of Brent, Platts, S&P Global Commodity Insights, as it's called, has incorporated the US WTI Midland crude oil into Platts dated Brent. And for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, you probably want to switch off now. But ultimately, this is the contract that prices the majority of the world's oil that we all put in our cars and in every other part of our lives. So it does touch everybody, even if you structurally don't quite get it. This is the first ever inclusion of a non-North Sea grade crude oil in a, Brent obviously historically is the name of a crude oil that's produced in the North Sea. This is the first time that a non-North Sea grade was included to boost liquidity in this most important physical crude oil benchmark. So that's kind of the context and the background to our conversation. And we have three very distinguished guests today to help navigate that discussion, who have all played and continue to play a pretty active role in that in the history as well as in the current. So great to have them. Let's kick off with Neil Fleming, Global Head of Editorial at Argus Media. I'm not sure Platts will enjoy that I'm giving it to Neil to kick off with, but nonetheless, Neil, in your editorial position as head of editorial at Argus Media, how significant a step is this? It's a month old now. Is it too early to tell the importance, relevance? Your thoughts as we kick off this new contract structure for Brent?
Thanks, Sean. From our perspective, certainly from my perspective, I think this is the biggest change we've seen in the evolution of Brent in more than 20 years, really. 22, 23 years ago, I enjoyed a similar position to this current one at Platts, in fact, and that was the time at which we introduced the so-called BFOET mechanism, as it now is, where a pool of crude oils were used to price the underlying crude as it started to dry up. We're back in the same place again now, with a drying up North Sea set of grades feeding into the Brent complex, and the addition of WTI, I think, is going to be a massive game changer for the way that crude works. In effect, Europe is likely to become an adjunct to the North American crude market. We're already seeing 100% of the cargoes entering the so-called chains in the Brent market are actually WTI since it was introduced. Interestingly, it's not just Platts that has included WTI. Most significantly, it's Shell that has rewritten its North Sea SUCO contract and explicitly said it will take into account not only cargoes pricing against Platts, but those pricing against Argus. And the significance of that is really that the thing underpinning a lot of the liquidity in WTI is futures-related trade in North America. We've seen a massive growth in the open interest in the CME's Houston and Midland WTI-related contracts. I think they came out in the press release a couple of days ago saying they've gone over the 500,000 mark. It's a real huge game changer for the whole industry, and it's what it's drawing on is a much greater volume of actual crude and a much greater volume of transactions in the North American market that are kind of enabling, if you like, the reinvigoration of the Brent benchmark through a transfusion of new blood. The volumes are sort of staggeringly different when you look at what was happening late in 2022.
Well, as you say, it's not only the newest and not only the first non-North Sea oil in this benchmark form structure, but it's also the largest component in terms of the volume of oil that is produced. Let's welcome Liz Bossley, CEO of Consilience Energy Advisory Group. And Liz also has a chapter in Addy's book. But Liz, I wanted to get your thoughts on the context of timing, and obviously your reference and your history gives you the privilege of being there at the beginning of the Brent contract. But this decision by S&P Global Commodity Insights, Platts, to change or evolve the structure of Brent with the inclusion of WTI predates any of the recent dramas. I mean, even predates COVID. It predates Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was something that was being proposed for a number of years, given the decline in North Sea Brent production. But it does feel like when it's finally landed, the timing couldn't be more perfect, given how much the structure of the market has changed. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. I've just recently put out a blog entitled "It's Brent, Jim, but Not As We Know It." And I think that's quite important for a lot of people to understand. We have retained the name Brent to keep the continuity, but the contract we have now bears very little resemblance to the contract where it started back in 1983. And I regret to say I was there. I've been around the block. In fact, I was there before they built the block. So I saw that evolving, and it evolved against a background of fixed quarterly prices determined by the state. The big change and the genesis of where we are now was when we started seeing more spot deals being done and the price reporting agencies performing a more fundamental role in the price formation process. When people started saying the price of the cargo is not $50 a barrel or $30 a barrel, it's the average of Platts or Argus, or back in the old days, LOR, averaged around a certain period plus or minus a differential. That's where it all came from. As those contracts or the production of all those volumes began to go down and we started to put in additional grades, I think the biggest change was really the window. That, to me, was an even bigger change than the introduction of WTI.
The window being?
The window being when during a certain fixed period during a day, a 15-minute window, the price of Brent is assessed by the PRAs based on bids and offers at that time in that window by a limited number of participants who have been pre-approved by the PRA. That's when we stopped having prices reported as deals done and it became deals assessed. This latest edition, WTI going into Brent, is taking that one step further and just widening out what we want from our index. We want a generic, what is the price today? And that's fine, but the fact that we continue to call it Brent is very misleading. And it's very misleading to the people who don't know the ins and outs of how this works. I work for a lot of small refiners, a lot of small producers who have price differentials that they negotiate to Brent. They are blissfully unaware that Brent is no longer Brent. And when they do their, gross product worth differential, grade differential assessments, they're doing it against some old assay of Brent, not against this basket, which bears no relationship to Brent at all. So we've put together this index, we've put in freight escalators, and we've put in quality differentials and sulfur de-escalators. It's a very complex animal, which the guys who are using it, who are many more than the guys who are trading it, don't really understand what's going on. And that is my worry, that the whole thing is going to come unstuck when someone loses money and decides they're going to challenge it and say, well, actually, you're calling it Brent, but it isn't Brent. Let's go to court.
Well, let's go to Kurt Chapman, who's also joining as the director of Zenith Energy. And of course, Kurt was a trader for 30 years, and his last sort of frontline position was head of international crude oil business for Mercuria, one of the world's largest energy and commodity trading firms based out of Geneva. Kurt, your thoughts on this change? What was broken that is now fixed? And will you and your peers, your former colleagues at Mercuria, be very happy with this development?
Thank you, Sean. Pleasure to be here today. I would say that with Brent, it's been an evolution. And the evolution started when the first molecules came out of the ground in the North Sea. And then there was a recognition, even as far back as 1990, that there wasn't going to be enough underlying physical oil to support the contract, at the time, the 15-day contract. You had the commingling with Ninian. Then, as Neil alluded to, we had the changes in 2002 where Forties and Oseberg were included in the Brent basket, Ekofisk in 2007, Troll in 2017, and now in 2023, we've gone outside the North Sea with another crude stream, which is WTI. WTI Midland essentially being the marginal barrel in the Atlantic Basin. And essentially, that's what Brent has always priced. Liz makes a good point that it's not Brent anymore because there's only 2 or 3 cargoes of Brent that are produced now. But the marginal barrel is still pricing in the Atlantic Basin, and it has the brand name of Brent associated with it. So this evolution has occurred over a long period of time. And what the industry has done and what the trading community has done in the same context is adapted as the benchmark has adapted. Has it become more complex? Yes. Is it more difficult to understand at times? Yes. But there's been a strong encouragement, a strong support for the benchmark to be maintained, both by the industry leaders, Shell, BP, Exxon, and the large trading houses, because it's become such an important pricing tool with a lot of instruments that you can use to hedge and a lot of different items, commodities that are priced off of it. So will we go through some challenging periods with the new introduction? I believe so. But on the other hand, we have done, again, for the last 40 years, and the industry will adapt and will be able to get their hands around this new animal.
Neil, I wanted the trigger, if you like, for the WTI piece, at least in its early years of when it was being sounded out, was to ensure the liquidity in the Brent contract, that the Brent contract had a sufficient amount of supply, less about maintaining Brent's position as the global reference price, which but now WTI is such a critical crude going into Asia, even before the recent dislocation in the Russian flows. I'm wondering from your perspective how important it is that this structure has come now in order for Brent to continue to be a global benchmark?
I think it's extremely important. The geopolitics of what is going on are actually fascinating. I think that we've got essentially a US crude that is by stealth or otherwise becoming the driving force for global crude oil pricing, not just because it's selling into Asia, but because it's almost certain to set the price of Brent most of the time going forward. We've been modeling the effects of putting WTI into the Brent pool since about 2018, and what that modeling shows is that WTI would have been the cheapest grade in the pool at least 50% of the time since then, and that on average it would lower the price of Brent by 80 cents when you take it over that period. And for those who don't know, the Brent mechanism is a lowest price count kind of pool mechanism in which none of the grades can, as it were, outstrip the others, because whatever is cheapest always winds up setting the price. So that is a sort of seismic shift in where the balance of power lies in terms of setting this benchmark. And as Kurt says, it's a benchmark that has fingers in many, many pies. Brent is used to price things all over the world. It's part of the Chinese gasoline retail price formula. It's part of the Australian retail price formula. All sorts of extraordinary places where it pops up and is interwoven into the pricing, really, of energy all over the planet. So it's a very interesting and significant moment, I think.
And on that,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, as a global head of editorial and news and journalists have to sort of cover this. I mean, from my years of experience, few journalists, even themselves, could explain to you, Brent, never mind the window before this. Does that matter, that granular understanding of the construction? I mean, Liz had pointed to some concerns about that, but from a reporting point, an editorial reporting point of view, these changes explained, is that of concern or not, or relevant?
I think it's important to be clear about what's going on, because there are wrinkles in all of this. The biggest one from my perspective is that for 40, 50 years, Brent has been an FOB crude, that is a crude that sells and prices at the point of loading. It's had what's called a program every month, so everybody knows how many cargoes are going to turn up of this stuff. When you start injecting into that crude oil that is an export crude from the United States, and nobody knows how many cargoes of crude of WTI will come from the US to Europe every month, because there will be competition for those cargoes from Asia, then you've got an entirely new game potentially in town in terms of how the pricing works. And that's something I think the market has yet to figure out, how this is really going to play out over time and whether it's going to work.
Liz, your thoughts on, again, I sort of in my opening comments, that the idea now that this contract, this new structure, is arriving at a time where the world is facing some very significant dislocations in the oil markets, and surprisingly, everything is adjusting reasonably well, it would appear. But nonetheless, we're seeing big change in oil flows, obviously Urals and Russian crude moving from west to east, and similarly Middle East products moving east to west, and so forth. So there, I wonder, and with that you have this sort of black fleet, this discounted crude. What challenges does that present to the efficiency and the arrival of this new structured contract?
Yeah, I think the thing I would say about the oil industry is, no matter what happens in the world, oil will continue to trade. Oil will always find a way. And if the market is choosing to use Brent with WTI in it, then it will be made to work because we can't afford for it not to work. My concern is that in assessing this price, which, as Neil said, pops up all over the world, not just in oil contracts, but in gas contracts. I've even seen it in coal contracts. That is a huge weight of responsibility resting on Brent, assessed in a small window of time each day by a PRA. That gives the PRAs huge power. And as we all know, with huge power comes huge responsibility.
Does the government intervention with the price caps and this political piece distort the accuracy and efficiency of that price, or does it ensure that the window is operating as you would expect?
I think the window is operating in isolation from what's going on in Russia with the sanctions, because those sanctions in reality have done very little. Yeah, they're there, they've changed the flow of trade, but the oil is still getting out. It's getting out through China, it's getting out even through Saudi Arabia. And as you say, we're getting product flows coming from east to west rather than down from the Baltic into Northwest Europe. It's changed the freight rates because we're using more long-haul vessels where before short-haul would do. So all of that is going on, and it's all being factored in. And it's being factored in by PRAs who are looking at all this myriad of factors and trying to make sure that the Brent that gets published reflects all of that white noise.
Kurt, your thoughts on that? I mean, clearly everything is flowing. That's probably the headline of the last 12 or even 24 months pre-Russia invasion of Ukraine. But nonetheless, it's flowing. Everything is getting to destination and to market. But is price discovery distorted by these layers of black market or black fleets, the traditional exchanges, etc.?
I think to answer that question, you would have to be the PRAs doing the assessment and ask them, what are you taking into account? With great power comes great responsibility. I hope to hell they're getting it right, because...
Kurt, your thoughts on that?
You know, it's a difficult question, right? I guess I would go back to, you know, what are we assessing here? We're assessing the marginal barrel in the Atlantic Basin, which we call Brent. The largest freely traded export stream of similar quality comes from the US. It is WTI Midland. I think export quantities, and I may be a little bit off on it, but we are looking at about almost 4 million barrels a day, half of which is probably working its way into Europe and half into Asia. We've tied WTI now into Brent. Brent being the global benchmark for crude oil. You know, that inclusion probably makes sense. In some ways, you would think that the Brent it solidifies the Brent benchmark as the global crude oil benchmark, because the oil can come into Europe or it can go to Asia. What we're not assessing is, we're certainly not assessing the sour market. And the sour market of Urals has been displaced out of Europe to the order of at least probably 1.5 million barrels a day pipeline and seaborne, and that's going to Turkey, India, China, and traditionally, as I think you all know, you know, the national oil companies in the Middle East set their own price, and they destination restrict their crude. So from a sweet benchmark standpoint, we're probably okay. From a sour benchmark standpoint, there's not a lot of price discovery or transparency, and there'll be less so while the sanctions are in place.
I'd welcome your thoughts on the same point there, Neil. I mean, the idea that we've had so much government intervention here, and even, I mean, it's government intervention that has allowed this to even take place, right? It's not very many years ago that there was the law was against U.S. export of crude oil, which is a relatively new construct and is now currently permitted. Who knows, that genie could be reversed. Your thoughts on this sort of political, this new flows structure and its challenge for the Brent contract?
Well, I think the flow of crude oil globally has always been tinted by politics. Ever since the formation of OPEC in 1960, arguably, and the arrival of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 also made a huge difference to the way the world looked at crude oil flow. From where I sit as the person with great power, as Liz says, we don't see government intervention in market structure with sanctions or whatever as actually having had the impact that governments maybe thought it would. When you look at a price cap, whether it's for crude oil or the European natural gas attempt at a price cap, those mechanisms overlook the fact that these are global markets and the oil finds its way to the marketplace in the long run anyway.
What about the challenge of the new contracts that have emerged in this region? We had the Murban contract, which is the sort of sweet Abu Dhabi crude, which could be considered similar to a Brent in terms, and a WTI in terms of its composition. And now there's talk of Upper Zakum, which is a more of a medium grade. These new contracts coming to market, do they present any challenge, or how do you see them coexisting?
I think at this point they don't present a giant challenge to the might of Brent, particularly with the inclusion of the whole of the WTI complex in that number, because what will happen probably is that Middle East crudes, traded as they may be, will become, as it were, adjuncts, derivatives to the major global benchmark, which will continue, as it has done for many years with Dubai and Oman, in a sense to drive global crude oil, albeit indirectly. I think the arrival of more alternatives can only be helpful and something that is really to be welcomed, because the monolithic nature of Brent does pose potentially a systemic risk.
Kurt, let's just give everybody a closing comments opportunity, starting with yourself about, this is clearly, as I think you've all said, and given your ability to have context of the history here, that this is an evolution, a constantly revised and improved and adapted for the current realities of the Brent contract, and the sort of sense in that still fit for purpose. But that said, what would you identify within the architecture of the Brent contract that still needs tweaking, that might be the next thing that might pop up with a red flag to find a better, more perfect union, as they say in the US?
I mean, I think it's a good point. I mean, what we've really gone from is an FOB contract to a delivered contract, which derives an FOB number. So we've added a freight element into this contract. And as we know, with freight, you have tremendous amount of volatility, particularly now that you have this dislocation with Russian Urals and the Gray Fleet and all these other things. So I guess I'm keeping an eye on, what does that freight element mean in terms of being able to assess this new Brent accordingly. So far, the indications are good. There's been 15 Brent Midland, WTI Midland forward cargoes that have gone into the chains in June. Brent Midland, WTI Midland has been setting the dated quote, as Neil has alluded to. So the mechanisms have worked. The structure of the market has not changed dramatically, but the freight element is one to watch. And when we get a tremendous amount of dislocation or volatility in that area, then it will reflect on whether the contract is structured correctly or not.
Liz, same to you. Your thoughts. Obviously, you expressed some concerns earlier that those tasked with the curatorship of this are on top of all the issues. What would you identify as possibly the next thing to watch, the next challenge? No?
I think if we get another sharp move in price, to the extent that somebody somewhere, possibly an American, loses money and decides to challenge this structure, it is held together. Everyone is doing their best. Those who are using it are doing their best to provide liquidity. But if it gets under the microscope of, say, the New York courts, goodness knows what they would make of this structure. And if someone particularly looks at their International Swaps and Derivatives Association contract and says, actually, when Brent changed and we included WTI and freight, that constitutes a reopener under the material change in formula clause in an ISDA contract. And I would be interested to see what a New York judge made of the current structure of prices, because I was around in the days of Transnor. If you remember, the Transnor Judge Connor said back in 1990 that Brent is a US market. When things get into court, the wheels can come off very quickly. I hope it doesn't. I hope that we continue to trade, but there are a lot of people out there at the moment using Brent without understanding Brent, and that is dangerous.
Where we started this conversation, Neil, and obviously last word to you, was the historical reference, and of course the new book that has been written by Adi Imsirovic on the genesis and the development of the benchmark. Is there anything deep in that book, in that narrative, in that history that is a lesson to keep front of mind as we look forward with this new structure?
I think if there's one thing, it is that crude oil is by its nature a finite resource. It runs out. It's very, very different in that sense from markets for things like refined oil products, where the flow is continuous and apparently eternal. And what we've learned over the past 40 years is that this is a benchmark that needs repair on a regular basis. And this feels like the latest repair. Whether we're really dealing with Theseus's ship, as Liz says at this point, that there isn't actually any Brent left in this mechanism. It's become an entirely different creature that may have long-term implications for how the global market pans out. And I think as a final note, I would say, with Europe has benefited over the past 12 months from a significant downturn in demand from China. When that demand picks up again, it will be very, very interesting to see what happens to that flow of WTI cargoes. Is it all still going to come to Europe, or are we going to find ourselves in some fierce competition for cargoes? And if that happens, what happens to the volatility of the price, to Kurt's point about freight?
Well, that might be the next repair. I'm not sure if one can repair that one. I think there's one thing for sure. China will be competition. There's no doubt about that on all fronts, and not just on this particular point and on the availability of WTI. But we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's edition of Halftime Talk, and really delighted and very grateful to have the time of Kurt Chapman, Director of Zenith Energy, Liz Bossley, CEO of Consilience Energy Advisory Group, and of course, Neil Fleming, Global Head of Editorial at Argus Media. Thank you guys for your time and your insights today.